Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our double podcast episode on the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first.
This is a union town, all down the line. This is a union town, all down the line.
Before we get into the episode, this is just a quick reminder that we are only able to produce this podcast thanks to support from our listeners on Patreon. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted merch and other content. Join us and find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Just a short content note that later on in this episode, there are 2 brief mentions of sexual violence. Where we left off last time, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers was pretty definitively shut out of official positions within the United Auto Workers Union, the UAW. This left the League no option other than to pursue their strategy of independent organising, media and communication, as General Baker, a worker at the Dodge Main plant, explained.
After the Dodge Main strike, people came from everywhere to want to be organized. And we would frankly just tell them, listen, we have paper, we have ink, we have some typesetting capabilities. We have some students and youth that'll help you distribute. We're not in your plant, we're not going in your plant. Whatever is taking place in your plant, you got to write it, you got to organize it, and we'll give you this level of support. And that's how we built LRUM and FRUM and JRUM and CRYRUM. And all of those other plants, all those other organizations came off of that with that model. We could not contain editorial control or nothing like that. People had to print whatever they chose to print, and we'd have to ride on that. So anyway, that's just a little background in terms of how we got off the ground, the methods that we had to use to organize, and that's kind of how we got started.
Now here General Baker mentioned a few other revolutionary union movements, or RUMs, the League started. LRUM at the Eldon Chrysler Axle plant, FRUM at Ford, CRYRUM at another Chrysler plant, and so on. In addition to their own publications, something which was central to the growth of the League was the South End newspaper. Dan Georgakas, co-author of Detroit I Do Mind Dying, told me more about this.
One of the things which, again, to show you what I consider the visionary part of this organization, Wayne State University had a newspaper called the South End, which published about 10,000 copies a day. It had never had a black editor. So John Watson decides, I'm going to become the black editor. The first thing he did was take enough courses to be eligible, and then ran and got elected. And he takes over the South End, and philosophically, thinking of Lenin, says, okay, this is a community-financed newspaper. It happens to be published on campus, but why should it remain on campus? Why shouldn't the public be able to read it? And so very slowly, this became a daily newspaper, which 5,000 copies, supposedly they were all being given on campus, but surreptitiously, 5,000 somehow found themselves to laundromats, community centers, factories, and so forth. And they began entering articles that you don't find in most college newspapers. And they had this saying underneath, one class conscious worker is worth 100 students. And people say, oh, they said, oh no, that's derogatory to students. And they said, no, it's just a historical fact that if all the factory workers went on strike, society stops. If all the students go on strike, everybody laughs. You know, I mean, it's very strategic. And so then they had a couple of issues. They were almost totally about the UAW and about drum. And gosh, about 8,000 copies showed up in the factories. So he was attacked immediately, you know, and he said, it's a community resource, you know, and I was elected and this is my editorial policy. And because they were practical, They kept the sports pages. They kept the fraternity pages. They kept all that stuff. So the student body, well, yeah, our newspaper, we're in there. I can see my picture. I can see what I'm interested in. So there was no student protest. And if you didn't like an article and you wrote a counter article, they printed it. Well, you see, common sense. Well, yes, but that's the point. It was common sense. And one of the things they tried to do was start up their own publishing company, which Freddie Perlman, who was anarchist, helped them with the technical setting it up. And they actually got one book out before the league fell apart, and they thought they would be able to publish their own newspaper. There's a whole history of how the police suppressed their newspapers. The government tried to suppress the South End, the college newspaper, because they took on a pro-Palestinian position. And they said, this is anti-Semitic. And this usually works, right? Didn't work with the league. They said, no, we're pro-Palestinian in the sense they're an oppressed people. And Detroit has America's largest Arab population, and therefore we're simply serving the community. And we've got Jews on staff. We have people writing counter articles. And boy, advertisers, the city, the state, the federal government, and they didn't budge, and they won.
Allegations of anti-Semitism in Detroit were also particularly ironic, given that the car industry mogul Henry Ford was a legendary anti-Semite who repeatedly published the anti-Semitic hoax document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in his newspaper, along with reams of other anti-Semitic propaganda. Ford was even awarded the prestigious Grand Cross of the German Eagle by Adolf Hitler's Nazi government, and Ford supplies Hitler's forces with vehicles during World War II.
I also have to point out that at Dodge, Maine, there were a lot of Palestinian workers. And if you look at some of the league posters are written in Arabic. And somebody said, oh yeah, that's for the black Muslims. No, it was for the Palestinians. And the league had a pretty good relationship with the Arab community. And Detroit was a hub of a kind of an Arab left awakening.
One employer where the league failed to build a strong base of activity was at Ford. And as General Baker explains, this was most likely because of the different history of the company, where black and white workers had already created strong bonds of solidarity through previous struggles.
The problem we had was that, how do I explain the fact that, when we built this movement in the city of Detroit, we had that very little input at Ford, like I just talked about. One group at the engine plant and one at Rawsonville. But the whole big, huge Roots conflict was there, and we didn't have much input in there. One of the reasons is that when we discover the development of the city and Henry Ford's attempt to try to diversify the workforce to such a degree that he became the principal person in terms of Detroit becoming the place it's become with this huge, big, black working class. So he got the unintended consequences of an attempt to do that. I think the figures are that in 1922, Ford Motor Company had 20,000 black workers, as early as 22. So he getting the unintended consequences of that work. The other thing is that the struggle to organize Ford in the 40s, that's almost never celebrated in this city. Because this is right now, the 70th anniversary of the Ford strike in 41. And it's never celebrated, even though we got White Shirt Day in Flint that's celebrated every day. And I think part of the reason for the lack of celebration for the Ford victory was the role that black workers played in organizing Ford. The Rouge plant would have never been organized had it not been the work of the black workers at that plant. Because the way Harry Bennett, who was Ford's henchman, organized it, he was attempted to turn the organizing strike in 41 into a race riot. That was his plan, to have a group of black workers stationed in the foundry. Many of them weren't even workers. They were just hired in the foundry on hold. So when the picket lines broke, the plan was to let them charge out of the plant, attack the pickets, turn the organizer strike into a race riot, force the governor to bring in the National Guard and crush the strike. And that was the plan. So therefore, all this effort had to be turned over to black workers, effort to organize black workers. The union put out 6 different editions of Ford Facts newspaper just for the black community. They organized the black preachers and all the black organizers to go into the black communities and organize them. They had they opened up 2 union offices, one on the east side in Hastings Street and the other one on the west side on Milford, so the workers could come and join the union without ever coming to the plant. They did all of these work. They put people on sound trucks. Reverend Hill preached sermons from Gate 3 for a week straight at the gate to win over those black workers in there. And after a week's time, the black workers came into the fold and joined the strike, and the issue was settled. But the fact that that can't never get celebrated is a problem. It's a problem for me, because I retired from Ford. And Ron and Judy and all us that worked there, it ain't never talked about that way, And the year be gone in a minute. So we have to celebrate something else. But I just want to mention that. But I think because of that, you had a different kind of solidarity that developed at the Rouge between black and white workers. I have Quill Petway, who's 95 years old now, told me that he was hired in the tool and die building in 41. After the riots in 43, the race riots in the city in 43, when he went back to work, when he walked into the tool and die building, all the workers stood up and applauded him because they were so happy that he lived through it, which is a different kind of solidarity than you had in all these other shops. You didn't have that at Packard. You didn't have that at Turnstead's. When blacks worked into the final assemblies in those plants, whites walked out and refused to work with them. So Ford had a different kind of cultural history gained through struggle that made it different than the rest of those plants. And that's why we never got a lot of traction at Ford, around fighting for equality. A lot of that went past us, and that's not saying that ain't no discrimination at the Ford shops. The damn sure is, because that's why we had Rawsonfield and Mawa. But at the Rouge plant in particular, you had a different kind of character.
One major issue for the League was health and safety in the plants. It was dangerous work. The UAW recorded 15,000 injuries a year around that time. And in the Eldon Axle plant in 1970, in just 1 2-week period, 1 woman and 1 man worker were killed in accidents. And rather than just pursuing official union management grievance procedures, League members continued a tradition from members of earlier radical unions, like the Industrial Workers of the World, of direct action on the job.
One of the activities of the League was to gather testimony from people who had been injured or killed, and one reason why certain factories immediately wanted to run and those that didn't was because of conditions. A forklift that didn't work correctly and killed a worker, speed up that injured people, all kind rulings about foremen that dealing with vacation time, sick leave, and all that kind of stuff. And the UAW just wasn't doing anything. They were speeding up the assembly lines, and one of the ways the workers retaliated on speed up was to lose a tool in the thing and break down the machine. Well, maybe it only took a half hour, an hour to clean it up, but...
Now, this type of sabotage wasn't appealing to management for breaks or trying to get breaks negotiated into a new union contract. It was workers creating breaks for themselves.
A lot of wildcats, and not in the difference between a wildcat strike, which is a strike which is not authorized by the union, and it usually starts in a factory, between now and then is if there was a wildcat strike, somebody shut down the thing, said, I'm walking, everybody would go out. Everybody would go out, and they say, well, what's it about? And then they may say, Joe, he's crazy, and go back in. Or they'd say, no, he's right. Which also brings us to the key difference of the League with the other black organizations at the time. Why black workers? Well, of course, they're from Detroit, no one from the working class. But philosophically, they said, how do you gain power? How do you control capital? You got to hurt their profits.
The late 1960s were times of heady optimism for radicals, and there were a rash of black revolutionary groups around the country. Herb Boyd, a member of the League and author of Black Detroit, was very much swept up in this mood.
You know, when you go back and look at the whole development of the factories in Detroit and what was happening with the workers and what happened with the kind of the dreams that we had in the 1960s when we thought that the revolution was right around the corner. And I think the League and Drum and looking at the Black Panther Party, the Shrine of Black Madonna, the Republic of New Africa, all these political formations gave us that same kind of hope and possibility that things are going to change so dramatically that suddenly you'll have the so-called, this dictatorship of the proletariat would assert itself in such a way as that we can hold back the kind of menace that was coming from the corporate capitalism in this country.
The Shrine of the Black Madonna is a Pan-African church in Detroit, which was an important organizing center for civil rights activism. The Republic of New Africa is a black nationalist group founded in 1969, based on the idea of creating an independent black republic in the US South. The Black Panthers were the most prominent black liberation organization at the time, and by so-called dictatorship of the proletariat here, Herb is referring to the Marxist terminology for an aspect of a socialist revolution. Now, how Marx used the word dictatorship is actually very misunderstood, even by a lot of Marxists, because it is not something counterposed to democracy as such, but this is getting away from the topic at hand. So we'll just pop some related reading in the sources for this episode. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers was different from all of these other black radical groups, both in terms of its focus on black workers at the point of production, and also in terms of how it was organized, as Darryl Mitchell, known as Waistline, explains.
General pointed out something that's overlooked about, a fact about the League that's overlooked. Because how the League was actually organized is important. All these different groups, including the student groups, and the groups inside of the factory had an autonomous existence. No one controlled them. Sometimes people will look at all the old literature and they say, well, it goes too far, it's too much profanity, it's this, it's that. There was no controls on what people wrote at their particular circle in their area. And I mention that because the League did not have this so-called hegemonistic structure. It simply isn't true. Each group had its own autonomy. And that's something that just needs to be talked about and brought out in the light of day.
First of all, they decided not to have a single leader. They would have a collective leadership, but not a central committee collective, but really a collective leadership. So there were 6. And if one of them got sick, if one of them got arrested, if one of them got goofy, it wouldn't ruin the organization. And that was a very conscious decision. I compare it more to anarcho-syndicalism. They always said, oh, we're Marxist-Leninists. They weren't Marxist-Leninists at all. They didn't have that kind of structure. They had more of an anarcho-syndicalist structure where the different units knew about each other, worked in concert, but they were not under direct orders.
So while the leadership of the group described their ideology as being based on the ideas of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, Dan believed that the actual functioning of the League as a group followed more the organizational model of anarcho-syndicalism. Anarcho-syndicalism is essentially anarchist trade unionism, which was applied by unions like the CNT in Spain, which we discuss in our podcast episodes 39 to 40 about the Spanish Civil War, or many early unions in Latin America like the Foro in Argentina. These were confederations of connected but autonomous, self-directed groups and industrial unions, without a central top-down leadership. Although we think it's important to stress here that the League was not ideologically anarcho-syndicalist by any stretch of the imagination, just that its organizational model of autonomous groups and collective leadership mirrors typical anarcho-syndicalist groups. The League also had an informal attitude towards membership.
The League was not interested in membership. In other words, it didn't say, sign up, or you're no good, or just sign up. Yeah, if you want to be active, that's good.
the League frequently engaged in acts of solidarity with non-members. One prominent example of this is the case of James Johnson. Johnson was a black assembly line worker, a Christian and an Army veteran at the Chrysler and Eldon Avenue axle plant, who wasn't a member of the League, didn't attend union meetings, and was just trying to save up to buy a house for himself and his sister. On the 15th of June 1970, Johnson was suspended for refusing to participate in a speed-up. He re-entered the plant later that day with an M1 carbine hidden in his overalls, and when he saw one of the foremen who'd been involved in his suspension, he started shooting. By the time he was done, 2 foremen were dead, 1 white, 1 black, as was a white job setter. Job setters set up and make minor repairs and adjustments to machinery, which is then run by machine operators. Johnson was then defended in court by Kenneth Cockrell, one of the members of the executive committee of the League, who was also a lawyer. Meanwhile, in the plants, the Eldon Avenue Revolutionary Union Movement, ELRUM, published a leaflet entitled "Hail James Johnson." The leaflet explained the context for what happened and blamed the deaths on intolerable working conditions at Chrysler and on Johnson's hard life, which had included him witnessing the brutal lynching of his cousin. Johnson had also lost his finger in a plant, suffered many other workplace injuries, and was racially abused by foremen who referred to him as, quote, boy and the N-word. The context of the events meant that he got a lot of sympathy from other workers at the plant. Leaflets supporting Johnson also appeared in plants around the country, as far away as New Jersey and California. In court, Cockrell fought to ensure that the jury should be integrated and include black people, working class people, and women, and he was successful in this. The defense presented evidence about Johnson's life, about the appalling conditions at Chrysler, and even took the jury to the plant so they could see it for themselves. A white worker who was a friend of those killed even told the judge, quote, "You ought to go to that plant and watch those men and see what it's like," end quote. In the end, the jury found that Johnson was not responsible for his actions, which infuriated the judge, who'd previously been a lawyer for the police. So rather than prison, Johnson was sent to a psychiatric hospital and released in 1975. Johnson was later awarded workman's compensation and back pay for injuries done to him by Chrysler. Now, members of the League felt that as black workers, they had to organise themselves autonomously, as most white workers and the UAW were happy to ignore the concerns of black workers. This was especially the case around questions like workplace disciplinary proceedings being biased against black workers, and there being a lack of opportunities for promotions for black workers. This is something that really struck a chord with me because in my time as a union rep, these are also issues which kept coming up, in that things that with white workers would just be taken as an innocent mistake, for black workers would be seen as negligence and misconduct and subject to disciplinary or underperformance procedures, and promotions constantly were awarded disproportionately to white workers. And this is 50 years later at a progressive public sector employer. So you can imagine how much worse things must have been back then. But some white workers and local residents did try to assist the work of the League.
You have to understand, it's called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. So you have to be concerned, like, well, how does whites fit into this? And whites did fit into it. We had a number of white individuals who were very close to the League at that time. You can talk about, Frank Joyce and Joanne Castle, Jack Russell. You can talk about John Sinclair, Lenny Sinclair. We had a number of individuals who were affiliates on the periphery and sometimes very much involved in promotion and making the fundraising, those kind of things. So the White Panther Party, that kind of thing, was something very, very current. And how we began to be very useful to each other. Our understanding about that is that whites should go into their own community and begin to politicize and organize and galvanize that community. We take care of ours, you take care of yours. And at some point, since we're on a progressive path, we can bring those ideas together to bring about a total change in our society.
The White Panther Party was a group formed by a group of white radical artists in Detroit, including John and Lenny Sinclair, in solidarity with the Black Panther Party and their struggle for self-determination and socialism.
Similarly with black women, the role of black women. It was very, very few in a position. Edna Watson, she did the former wife of John Watson, did a nice piece in the second edition of Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. And I think there's no way I'm going to cover all of the stuff we need to cover, but I would recommend that our listeners pick up Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, both the first, second edition, and get some of the ideas that I can't cover here fully, and break them down so you can understand some of the very positive and some of the negative aspects, so you can get an understanding on how you can use that as a primer, how you can use that as a teachable moment, and how we can move forward on that. Same thing as I say with Black Detroit is to go back, because I cover a lot of this stuff in terms of the role of Black women across the city's history. If I focus on my mother alone, you get a good idea. She becomes almost emblematic, symbolic, of that particular drive and ambition and concern, and how it plays into the larger picture, and understanding the dynamic of, how corporate capitalism came to power in the city of Detroit, and Detroit becomes so pivotal, in the whole nation's economy. In terms, the nation sneezes, Detroit comes down with pneumonia. So it's a very significant role that the city has played, and of course the engine of that city has always, from my perspective, been the Black workers, and that means Black men and Black women, at the point of production.
While the League was predominantly male, women played an important role in the organisation. They also attempted to organise a health workers' RUM, although without much success. Unfortunately, the group did reproduce sexist dynamics, both of wider society and of the general workers' movement and the white left, with many women activists in more clerical type supporting roles rather than leading roles. Some women members were also subjected to sexual harassment and assault, a problem which continues to plague all aspects of our society, including revolutionary movements, today. General Baker also spoke about the crucial role women played in the League.
I just wanted to point out that we had at least 3 community organizations that we were solidly based in while we organized in the plant. Mm-hmm. We had the Unicom organization, West Central organization, and North Woodward Interfaith. And without the women that was active on those fronts, we wouldn't have not had the resources that was necessary, to try to surround the plant and try to organize it.
In the early days of the League, there weren't many women working inside the plants, but this started to change as time went on.
We had one real active woman at Dodge was Betty Griffin. We called her Betty Booth. And when you ever see those drum posters, she was one of our candidates on that. But we didn't have a lot of women at that time that came into the shop at 68. But they started coming in right after that, 70, 68, 70, and so forth.
As you can probably imagine, employers in Detroit were not happy about having an active, militant, and openly revolutionary organisation of Black workers, so they fought back against the League with the help of police and city authorities. Under pressure, divisions within the group started to grow.
Let's put it this way. The entire Detroit power structure was against the League because they understood these guys they decided not to bargain with them. The first thing was to give some chips. And when the chips weren't taken, the media turned against them. I mean, it wasn't even for them. Turned up the heat. The government turned up the heat. All kinds of pressures all along the way. Now, they were not able to create violent incidents as it did with the Panthers because of the strategy that the League used. And they had to be very careful because of the popular identification people had. But it was always there. It was always there. So grinding away. And the police were cooperative. I mean, all those kind of things. Your income taxes were suddenly examined, draft card numbers were pulled, all that kind of stuff.
So some members of the League, like many young working class men around the US, were drafted to go and fight in Vietnam. We talk a lot more about the draft and ways people resisted and avoided it in our podcast episodes 43 to 46 about the anti-war movement.
Luke Tripp was one. And of course they didn't. Some of them just left the country and some went into hiding.
And employers relied on their primary power, their control over the jobs.
And the firing, and what the firing, see, you don't have to fire the leadership. You just have to fire anybody come close to them. Then people say, if you get close, then you're going to get fired. Or something will happen. Suddenly you're working night shift when you want to work day shift. You're working in this job instead of that job. So there was enormous pressure on them at all times. So there are those kind of issues. But I think, if you say I'm going to overthrow capitalism, you're taking on a big opponent.
One of those fired after a wildcat strike was General Baker, who wasn't able to get another job in the car industry for 5 years afterwards, until he eventually got hired at the Ford Rouge plant under a false name. The League also suffered from the same kind of organisational problems which any new radical group develops when they start to have some level of success.
They had this problem of expansion. How are you going to expand from this people who knew each other since childhood or had 10 years of experience, and now new people are coming in, and you got to take them in. You got to take somebody in, otherwise you're going to stay the same thing. But how do you decide who's a provocateur, who's a splitter, who's just a little goofy?
I'm sure that some listeners who've been involved in lefty groups will be familiar with this sort of situation, especially in times of upswings in struggles, like in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2007-9, when lots of people who were in small but stable radical groups suddenly have loads of new people wanting to join and get involved, which is great, of course, but it brings difficulties because, on one hand, new people might not have the same amount of political agreement on various issues you haven't had time to go into yet. They might have different ideas about strategy. They may not be serious. They might just be looking for a social club or what have you. And on the flip side of this, existing members might not want to have their preconceptions challenged. They may feel that their level of power and influence in the group might be under threat. They might be resistant to change, even if that might mean working in new, better ways, and so on. To this standard mix, you've also got to look at the context of the time, which especially for black revolutionaries in the US in the late 1960s and early 1970s was extremely dangerous. The FBI had its COINTELPRO counterintelligence program, through which it was infiltrating and disrupting radical groups, especially groups led by black people, Native Americans, and other people of colour. And the stakes were high. It wasn't just about lefty groups splitting and infighting like today. People were being assassinated by the FBI, like Black Panther Fred Hampton. People were being snitch-jacketed, that is to say, made to look like informants by the FBI, and people were being tortured and killed because of it. One development which proved divisive for the League was the famous civil rights leader James Foreman, who moved to Detroit and got involved in the group. His prominence enabled the group to raise money to set up a publishing house, Black Star Press, but then his individual prominence and access to resources then gave him disproportionate power over the organisation. So all of these factors were in the mix as the League developed.
At the same time, you had concerns about, growing it so fast and reaching so far without consolidating it at home. And so it leads to some of the internal contradictions. There's some differences in the executive committee. People who are concerned that, we really should be moving more and more to organize the workers at the point of production and the plants and everything. That's our lifeblood. That's the mother's milk of our struggle. And not be reaching out to all these other ancillary aspects in terms of whether you're talking about a film, whether you're talking about a book coming out. Of course, one of the books that came out was The Political Thought of James Foreman that was put together by Black Star Press. He was able to do that because largely he had brought in the finances for it. So, but many people thought that was like a waste of money. It could have been done, spent better otherwise. So all these differences are occurring, to say nothing of the personal concerns and the treatment of black women within the organization, some of the kind of sexual harassment and the kind of, reducing them and name calling and even rape, all these kind of things were concern of the more conscious members of the organization. So, but added up, it began to point to some very destructive elements that was falling apart. That it, despite the efforts of somebody like a Mike Hamlin, for example, who was probably one of the more conscious, mature thinkers in there, concerned with the harmonizing things. But that's a hell of a load to put on him. And I think it had much to do with some of the kind of physical and mental problems that's going to handicap him later on. I mean, that's a formidable task that he had, trying to hold together all these disparate parts, people trying to go this, that, and that way. And at last it fell apart.
And what began to happen was Watson, Cockrell, Hamlin really thought the most important thing was to have broad coverage. We were protected by publicity. We reach out and build ourselves that way. And General Baker, John Williams, Luke Tripp began to feel that, no, we got to really concentrate on the factory and we better keep the lights off, going to make it a little clandestine. Not that we're doing anything illegal, but just being clandestine because the company will retaliate. And that group began to gravitate toward the Communist Labor Party and thought, we need a vanguard party, we're too loose. And the other guys said, no, the last thing we need is a vanguard party. And then there was all the usual, like, well, Kenny's getting an awful lot of publicity, that kind of stuff. And so the organization kind of fell apart.
Eventually, the external pressures and the internal contradictions within the group led to its demise and splitting. But this doesn't lessen the fact that the group was active in and helped win improvements on the job which lasted beyond the organisation itself. And in addition to these concrete gains, the group had a significant impact on the black working class in Detroit, and in the wider workers' movement, and its official organisations, like the AFL-CIO Union Confederation and its member unions.
Well, we can point to a number of accomplishments that was made, certainly to do with the union organizing at that time, the pressure that was put on the UAW, AFL-CIO, Teamsters, and what have you, is the role of the black worker within these organizations and putting pressure from the rank and file on the leadership to take care of some of the concerns we had, whether it was on the floor, inside of those factories, whether you're talking about the larger formations of that organization in terms of having our voices represented there. All of that pressure, was put on these unions, and later on we see some results of that in terms of the positions of certain individuals as they rise within those organizations, become on this executive council, this particular executive commission, part of one of the caucuses and what have you. So all of those are developments that take time in terms of absolute, consistent, determined struggle. So some of the most important thinkers that we had, losing a Ken Cockrell, losing a Mike Hamlin, losing a General Baker, all of those people are no longer around to have this kind of intergenerational dialogue, which I think is probably the most potent thing we have going now, is to look at Black Lives Matter and the whole Me Too and Time's Up. All those things are inspirational. But it harkens back to a time when we thought, that those would be the seeds that we needed to plant. They can bury us, but we're the seeds. We're going to grow out of this here burial. But it was just too much to fight back against. And finally, you had people who were co-opted. Some individuals right there, suddenly they said, well, look, this is really futile. It's impossible. I'm going to have to try something else. Strategically, tactically, I think I need to move in another direction. And they had every right, to make a decision about their own prospects, what they want to do with their lives. And seeing that they no longer won't be a member of an organization because the organization wasn't going anywhere. So you have this kind of defeatism that was so widespread. And you only had 3 or 4 individuals out there of any kind of, real magnetism and charisma who could kind of galvanize and bring things together.
For Dan, a real lesson of the experience of the United Auto Workers Union in the League was how by its own disregarding of its black members, it weakened itself and the workers' movement as a whole.
The tragedy for America was UAW in 1960 was still a pretty strong union. if it had seen these black revolutionaries as new blood, real fighters who were going to go in there and do things and resist the company, it could have revitalized the industry. Detroit is one of the few places where in those radical groups I was talking about before, they talk about automation. And they said, we're going to lose this job unless we control automation. If you control automation, you can get profits and you can work less hours for the same money or more money. But what they're going to do is take the jobs away and make the others work harder for less. They knew that. So if the UAW had embraced that, who knows what they'd been able to do. At that time, they had not moved so many factories to the right-to-work states. Well, if you have a general strike on the basis of you're not moving these factories, they might have won. A right-to-work state means that you don't have to join a union even if people voted in, which is, and that comes the whole series of other restrictions as how do you get a ballot to vote, how do you count the votes and all that kind of stuff. The UAW had been very unsuccessful in organizing the South. And you just say, what if they had said to General Baker and some of those guys, look, here's some funds, go down and organize. You just don't know. And so what I say is the UAW really failed its own tradition. Now, what happened later on, in the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of the people who've been in the league ended up being elected and doing things, but it was too little. Too late, more than too little.
People often blame jobs going overseas as a reason for the decline in employment in manufacturing industries like automobiles in the West. But in reality, the main reason for the decline in the number of jobs is automation. Both in the US and UK, more cars are manufactured now in both countries than they were in the 60s and 70s, just with far fewer workers. In the US, jobs were also relocated from areas like Detroit with better organised workers to states with more anti-worker laws and less union organisation. This has enabled car companies to gradually erode paying conditions for their workers over the years. The economic and political environment today is very different from that of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Waistline and Mitch believe we need to get to grips with that to be able to apply the lessons from the work of the League to our situation today. Bear in mind again that these audio clips are from a meeting in 2011.
And that's kind of our role at this point, to be educators, right? And to talk about why today is different from yesterday. We cannot, and I love it, but the League is gone. It's been gone 40 years. We cannot go back to that period of time. Even if we wanted to, we can't. What has changed in our society is the means of production, and we have to mention that and talk about it. And I got another point, and I'm through, I give it up. But we look at this thing critically, and we look at, back then we studied Marx. Karl Marx is not a bad word to us. I would strongly suggest anybody who hasn't read or studied Marx to look at him again for the first time. See, Karl Marx has come back more times than Michael Jordan. He got more hits than Michael Jackson. He's not going to go away, whether we want him to or not. But Marx has this incredibly simple law. It is so simple that I did not graduate from high school. If I can get Marx, I'm telling you, anybody can understand it. He has this tiny law. It says that when means of production change in society, the society has to organize itself around new means of production. Period. End of story. That's it. The steam engine meant that society had to reorganize itself around the steam engine and the technology implied in it. It brought the society based on a plow to an end. But the plow represented a revolution because a plow was more productive than a bow and arrow, right? Than a hoe, right? Each of these means of production create and gives you the basis for a new society. I grew up, man, where for me, this is a miracle. All of us old heads know that this is a new technology. Now, what we face is a new technology. We can call it computers, the information age, whatever you want to call it. I'm learning how. Some young people told me this on tour, because I asked them what the hell is taking place. They call it the robotic economy. And I said, okay, because I was calling it the electronic revolution. I'm through with that. We're dealing with the robotic economy because the young people told me we were. Now he said, this is the, see, look, in a robotic economy, society has to reorganize itself around that. That's it. They call that social revolution. Our job is to fight in a way where the society is set up in our favor. That is the legacy of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Its legacy is that you study, you become cultured and educated so that you understand and can aid the next generation of revolutionaries. And that next generation made itself apparent September the 14th, 17th, when did Occupy begin?
17th.
The 17th of September. And we've been waiting for you 30 years. Welcome. Welcome. You know.
One thing we were clear about after the split was that we didn't know nothing. You know, that through all these struggles, all this literature, all this, that we still didn't know nothing.
Yeah.
You know, so we embarked on a path to try to educate ourselves. We met, studied revolutionary works, you know, and we did. At that time, we didn't understand where we were in history and what was possible for us and what our task was at that time, you know, and we just didn't understand. You know, we were not in a revolutionary situation. You know, mostly we could only fight for reforms at that time to try to fix what was wrong about the ills of society, you know. We were still not ready to make a step to the next level, you know. Here today, as we look back, you know, we could see that, you know, relatively clearly. You know, we're in a different epoch now, you know, that has been created by what Waistline refers to as the robotic economy. The period that we left was a period of industrial growth, you know, when opportunities abounded for, you know, for everyone. I'm sure that people here from Detroit anyway can remember there was a time in the 60s where you get 3 jobs at each factory the same day. You know, General emphasized how important our labor was because when the rebellion, you know, he had mentioned if you had a badge, you could go to work. They didn't care whether you were a terrorist, whether you were a black nationalist, you could go to work. Just get through the line as long as you get that ass on that assembly line. You were okay, you know, as long as you were making these cars, you know. So today, opportunity of a different nature, you know, abounds for us. You know, we cannot go back to the type of economy we had before. You know, we're entering into an era that is decreasing the level of human participation in the labor process. Yet people have to eat. Yet people have to live. And we've got to find a solution to how to do that. You know, our distribution is based on money. And there's a certain amount of our population that's being separated from production, which is how you get money. So how are they going to live, you know? And these are real questions that can be answered today. They couldn't have been answered in the 60s, the 70s, but they can be addressed today. In the richest country on earth, we have people starving to death when we have an abundance of food. We have people dying because they can't get the proper medical attention. We have seniors who have to opt to pay the light bill instead of getting medications and, you know, things like this. And, you know, our kids are not being educated. Furthermore, they don't have much of a future, you know. So our struggle has to take a different turn. Our struggle has to be for everyone to have the necessaries of life, to be able to live.
An important element often overlooked in the history of social movements and organisations is the transformative effect which taking part in them has on the participants themselves.
I was always excited about the Revolutionary Union movement, particularly when I found that a number of those workers in the plants were now trying to improve themselves at the academy. Suddenly they were still working on these jobs. And I find it particularly true with black women that I've been teaching over the last 30 years here in New York. Because at one point when I was at the College of New Rochelle, I would have 35 students in the classroom, and 31, 32, and sometimes even 33, 34 would be black women, and only one or two black men in there. And so they become like my heroines, see that, knowing full well that most of them have children, most of them got a job, usually hooked up with some agency or the city, and at the same time trying to go to school. And I just had to applaud them, that kind of determination, the desire to improve their lot. And that's always so inspirational, and I saw the same thing in Detroit when these workers from Dodge and Ford, from River Rouge, trying to improve their lives and hold down a job in the factory and still go to classes, absolutely exhausted sometimes, and not even have a chance to eat, but be in that classroom, trying to increase and improve themselves, the possibilities, the dreams that they had. That continues to be, for me, the kind of one thing that I think I hold out hope and keeps me optimistic is that we got another crew coming on, another shift that's coming on. And I think that they're going to be a little bit wiser. And I hope that they kind of study the past. You have to face forward, but you got to look back. You got to see that past is prologue. You got to find a way to kind of get in touch with some of those people who were there, the veterans of the struggle, and listen to them. That's what I did. That's what I learned from some of the individuals who had been on the ramparts. And I guess I've been on the ramparts quite a while myself, and I get these young people in my classroom, and one of my students walked up and asked me if I knew Frederick Douglass. And I said, well, I haven't been on the ramparts that long, but I know what you're talking about.
Good memories are forever, said the dog on the tombstone. If you're living underneath the bridge, man, all roads lead to home.
That concludes our double episode about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. We've got additional audio from this episode from our conversation with Herb available exclusively for our Patreon supporters. So you can check that out and support us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. If you can't support us right now, no worries. Please just share links to our episodes on social media and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. At this same time period during the Vietnam War, there was a wider strike wave in the US. In our episode 8, we talk about this with historian Jeremy Brecker, so give that a listen if you fancy. As always, we've got links to sources, transcripts, and further reading on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links where you can get hold of Dan and Herb's books. Thanks again to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Connor Canazzi, Shay, James, Ariel Joya, Stone Lawson, and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Music used in these episodes is Uniontown, performed by the Night Watchman, Tom Morello. You can buy it or stream it on the link in the show notes. Thanks to the Bristol Radical History Group for the use of the audio clips from their meeting. And finally, thanks to you for listening. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Catch you next time.